But where it has a particularly negative impact is on the work that advanced the interests of the whole sector in terms of reform of regulation that affects the sector or the creation of a home in government.
You're listening to Let's Imagine, an Imagine Canada podcast for everyone interested in social issues and the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Bruce McDonald. At Imagine Canada, we believe that by leveraging our national vantage point, building cross-sector relationships, and sharing and developing our knowledge base, we can advance social, economic, and environmental justice through our collective action. Join us as we dive deep into conversations that have big implications for the nonprofit and charitable sector here in Canada. A special thank you to our knowledge partner, Carter's Professional Corporation, and our supporting partner, Sage Canada. Together, let's imagine a stronger future. Over the last few years, we've been experiencing a number of situations where organizations have drawn unwanted attention. A pattern that has emerged when looking at these situations has been questions about their governance practices. These range from overly complex structures to issues about what the board knew and when, to the influence of founders. With trust being at the heart of the relationship between Canadians and charities and nonprofits, uncertainty about the sector's governance practices is concerning. We're joined today by Yves Savoie. Yves is a longtime leader in our sector, having most recently been with Heart and Stroke and the MS Society of Canada. Currently, Yves is a strategy and governance advisor specializing in working with the nonprofit sector. Yves is also a former chair of the Imagine Canada Standards Council. Yves, thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much. You're most welcome.
So we're going to kick off by just setting the stage a little bit. The last few years have seen too many media reports that have called our sector's governance into question, whether it's justified or not. A few organizations that have been under scrutiny for their governance practices. We Charity's an example, Hockey Canada's another, and more recently, the Trudeau Foundation. These are different situations, but they have one thing in common. They contribute to eroding trust in our sector. Can you speak to the impact of such situations from your perspective on the 170,000 nonprofits that do amazing work in our sector?
Bruce, I'm concerned about the impact, in part because the three situations that you've mentioned do generate a lot of media attention, major media attention in a sustained way. And what it means is that for many Canadians, when they hear about charities, this is what they're hearing about. It's not good. I would draw one important distinction because two of those situations, the Trudeau Foundation and the We Charity scandal, have aspects of the stories that are as much about political scandal as they are about issues of governance with not-for-profits. Hockey Canada is the most troubling of them all, I think, and it does not have an element of political scandal attached to it. It is really all within the organization itself. But as you probably know well, the Moutard Foundation commissioned in 2013, I think, a study of the trust that Canadians have of charities and their leaders. And what they found is that while it's high, it was declining. It hasn't been repeated, but my suspicion is that remains true. Trust in charity leaders and in charities is high, but it's declining. And what we also know when you think of the engagement of Canadians in volunteering or in giving, is levels of engagement are flat to declining. And you're quite right. Trust is at the center of this all. People give of their time, give money, engage in doing good through charities and not-for-profits when they trust. And so I'm concerned. And I think there are things that we can do to prevent these kinds of situations.
So thanks, Yves. We're going to explore a number of different aspects of this, beginning with the relationship to government. Another more public, controversial, and unique aspects of these stories is the political side of them. They can begin as an examination of the practice of the organizations and quickly spill over into becoming political in nature. And our sector is a major employer in Canada. At the time of this recording of this episode, the sector counts 2.7 million people who work for charities and nonprofits, and it contributes about 8.4% of Canada's GDP. Like other industries, government relations are key to strengthening our sector, and these ultimately benefit communities and all Canadians. So when controversies emerge, it affects our relations with the government. So what are, in your view, the main challenges working with government when these kinds of situations surface?
I think the We Charity case was particularly serious in that I think it created a chill for Monsieur Trudeau, for our Prime Minister, and for the then Prime Minister, in terms of talking about charities. It probably not for individual charities or subsectors, but where it has a particularly negative impact is on the work that advanced the interests of the whole sector in terms of reform of regulation that affects the sector or the creation of a home in government. Those kinds of issues, I think, require an environment free of that kind of noise or that kind of political risks. And we now have the Trudeau Foundation issue, which again links the Prime Minister, issues obviously of foreign interference into our elections. And these matters are top of the news cycle on a sustained basis. The Trudeau Foundation finds itself enmeshed in that. And I don't think it helps at all. We also saw, we'll all remember the sponsorship scandal years ago when Mr. Chrétien was Prime Minister. And I think one of the things that arises when there are scandals of this kind is you can have a response by the government eventually that creates very weighty and excessive regulation. And I don't think this is what is necessary as a response, but I fear that might be the response, meaning that there's an overbearing response that will create a lot of burden for charities and not-for-profits, particularly small ones.
And that's a great point, Yves. We certainly saw the pendulum to really onerous accountability provisions for government grants and contributions come into play after the sponsorship scandal. And as we seek to have more reasonable practices within government, one can extrapolate that these kinds of things don't necessarily help us. They make it more difficult. So one of the other areas that we're going to look at is around this issue of accountability. So when a charity's practices are publicly called into question, inevitably we hear some people call for greater oversight of charities and nonprofits, despite the fact that for our sector, it's really quite highly regulated in Canada. What are your thoughts about this? And what other approaches could be considered to foster trust and strengthen our sector's relationship with both the government and the general public?
I actually think, generally speaking, that a regulatory response is not what is required. I think if I take Hockey Canada, for instance, the issues there are issues that are not going to be fixed by regulatory reform. The tremendous harms that are alleged to have been caused, and there's good reasons to believe that they've been caused, were a failure of people who were leaders at the time at Hockey Canada, not a failure of regulation, in my view. In the We Charity context, I would draw one exception to this role, to this view that regulatory response is not what's required. In the We Charity context, you have a charitable organization which is linked to a commercial one. And one of the things that is impossible in terms of the accounts that are provided by charities that may have founders or directors who own a commercial organization that is not owned by the charity, but which may sell goods to the charity. And this is the context at We Charity that made it very difficult to know if there was undue private benefit. So if you're a charity, that is fundamentally the rule. Your resources must serve a public benefit and not a private one. And undue private benefit puts at risk your charitable status. This raises grave questions. And I think that's an area, it's a unique area, but it's an area that might benefit from a requirement for increased transparency about the use of those related entities, commercial in this case. But outside of that, outside of this very specific example, I actually think our regulatory framework is sound. I think the failures that we're talking about in this context are failures of oversight, failures of the board's oversight over the affairs of the charity in question, or in Hockey Canada's case, of the Amateur Athletic Association. We'll talk about those in greater detail. And there's one of the questions. Sports Canada funds Hockey Canada, and this is not a regulatory response. It's a grants and contribution response. One might ask why the department was not more vigilant in its oversight, given that Hockey Canada received substantial public funding. And again, I think there's good reason to believe that its assessments lacked some vigilance, and that some of this might have been unearthed through the good work that governments do when they have a funding relationship with a charity or a not-for-profit.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And I think it's interesting, some of the points that you raised about the relationship between a registered charity and another structure that is income generating, I think also creates a lack of clarity and maybe a bit of confusion amongst the general public in terms of understanding the relationship between those various entities that might be in place. Let's focus our attention more specifically on governance now. And you've been in the sector a long time and have worked with boards of directors, worked with organizations. So from your perspective, what foundational governance principles should charities and nonprofits apply to ensure that their organization is managed according to best practices, to mitigate risks, and to demonstrate transparency?
The governance is fundamentally about who has power to make decisions, who has a voice in those decisions, and how those decisions are communicated. And how those decisions are communicated is really about accountability. Who has a voice is who's heard, right? And the reality is, I think we can thank Enron, the world's largest corporate scandal, for significant spotlight on the quality of governance generally across the corporate commercial sectors and our sector. And I think some of those things have brought really significant and valuable improvements. One is this notion that the boards have a significant and towering responsibility to exercise an oversight function. And this oversight function requires of them to ask probing and sometimes difficult questions of management, and that they should be independent of management in doing so. That culture of inquiry, that capacity for boards to build a respectful partnership with management while holding them to account, is what failed at Hockey Canada, in my view. And that's one of the challenges that charities have in particular, because the incorporating statute prohibit the remuneration of directors for their services, directors on the boards of charities, is that the directors are volunteers. And sometimes they'll say, oh, we can't ask that, or we can't expect that of a volunteer. I say, if they are a member of the board, the bar has to be high. And they have to take their work seriously. At law, they're required to be diligent, to be present at meetings, to be prepared, and to exercise care, meaning to apply a standard in their deliberation, which is the standard that a prudent person would apply. And I think at Hockey Canada, you see a lot of evidence of decisions that were made where there was clearly an intent to hide those decisions from public view, to not maintain a record of the decisions made. In the very, very fine report that the retired Justice Cromwell of Canada's Supreme Court authored when the scandal at Hockey Canada broke, and by the way, this report is available publicly, he mentions a conversation with a leader of Hockey Canada who explained that their audited financial statements were not made available to the public. So this is an example of a good practice that encourages transparency, for fear that they would be perceived to be too rich. And I laugh at that acknowledgement, that in a conversation with Justice Cromwell. For one, it showed a desire to actually keep that hidden, meaning the significant excess cash, and to not be transparent. The reality, for instance, is that the decisions that were made to pay cash settlements to settle and to buy the secrecy of women who are alleged to have suffered harm, those weren't minuted. And those decisions were made in camera sessions of the board. And Justice Cromwell very rightfully notes that if decisions are made in an in-camera session of a board, doesn't mean that they need not be minuted. They might be minuted as part of a confidential addendum to the minutes, and those minutes might be circulated to only the directors, for instance. But those are examples of a real lack of transparency and of diligence in the kinds of decisions that have very serious implications. These settlements were about buying the secrecy of women who had allegedly suffered abuse at the hand of hockey players. So I think these are the kind of, for me, the focus is on the quality of the oversight, the diligence, the standards to which they are held, and that's where I think the failures were.
So we focused our conversation around some of the more higher profile examples that we've seen, but let's maybe step back a little bit. As you've worked in the sector, from your perspective, what do you think are the most common examples of mistakes that you see organizations make most often when it comes to governance? The regular everyday charities and those kinds of things that they could do better. Are there ones that leap to mind?
There are a number of areas, I think, where that for instance, having terms and a limit to the number of terms and being very proactive in the recruitment of directors so that you balance a number of directors who served for a longer period of time with some new blood. And proactive, meaning you understand and you've defined what is required at the board. So you might be losing a skilled volunteer lawyer who served on your board, and you're going to need someone with legal expertise or someone who might have experience as a user or a beneficiary of your programs, who will have passion about what you do for kids who are homeless or who benefit from mentorship, for instance. So very proactive recruitment. By the way, it's a constant activity. It's not something you do 3 weeks before an AGM, because volunteers are the best volunteers will want some runway before they accept an invitation to join a board, a specific term, a limit to the number of terms. I'm more indifferent to the limit, but I would just acknowledge that typically terms are either 2 or 3 years, and the typical limit is 6 to 9 years, meaning the total period. There's sometimes exceptions made for officers. And the other aspect, and Justice Cromwell talks about this in a very nice way, talks about the importance of diversity on the board. And I'm talking here about the diversity of individual characteristics of sex, gender, age, race, ethno-racial background. One of the areas, for instance, where Hockey Canada just sorely lacked was in the representation of females on its boards. That reality, they had no francophones on the board at the time when Justice Cromwell prepared his report. So we know that diversity on a board improves the quality of governance. We also know Senator Ratner did some really important work to wake us up to the fact that in general, the boards of charities are not reflective of the diversity of Canada's population. The notion of independence is also raised, and I think this is particularly important for people who are involved in organizations that are federated or part of a larger network, meaning where you have organizations at the local or provincial level that are connected to a national organization that is the backbone. And Hockey Canada is one of those. There are provincial organizations that feed into Hockey Canada as the national organization. There are local ones as well. And Justice Cromwell talks about the importance of having a number of directors who are independent. And in this context, doesn't mean independent from management, but he means independent from those other bodies to which Hockey Canada is related. So not part of the provincial hockey federations. And I think that in the work that I do with federated organization, this notion of independence is actually really, really important. I actually think the practice of in-camera session, I've just mentioned them earlier, to provide it on a routine basis, a space for the board to meet alone with the executive director or the CEO, and then alone without any members of management is important. Gives the board a place to deal with matters of relationships among directors, issues of conflict within the board, et cetera, et cetera. I think there are practices in terms of transparency. I talked about financial statements earlier, but I'm seeing a growing number of organizations. There's some beautiful examples in this context that are choosing to post their organizational policies in their About Us tab on their website. So their whistleblower policy or their workplace harassment, violence, or workplace relationship policies are in public view. So if you're a donor or a potential donor or a future employee or a future volunteer, you can have a good sense through a quick read of those policies of the kinds of commitments that the board has made and which govern the organization. So I actually think that some of the learnings that we saw from the pandemic, including the use of Zoom for virtual meetings, also gives us an ability for boards to meet more often in short sessions, for annual general meetings to be more engaging and to provide an ability for people from a large geographic area to come together. And I think that that's generally a very good development. And finally, I would return to this notion of board recruitment. I'm observing that a lot of organizations are actually approaching the recruitment of board members in the way that they approach recruiting employees. They post an ad. They post an ad on a LinkedIn site or in their social media channels, and the ad makes clear what they're looking for. So they've clarified the priorities. So this kind of transparency, this kind of proaction, combined with the diligence of the directors who are serving, and a real commitment to a culture of inquiry.
Those were great thoughts, even great examples. One of the ones I maybe invite you to reflect a little bit are maybe some lessons learned from the example of the Trudeau Foundation. As you've been thinking about this and observing it, do you see alternative approaches that emerge to governance from this conversation, or thoughts around governance and what needs to change using that as an example?
Yeah, the Trudeau Foundation is a really interesting example. As by the way, there's less written about it, except through the media. The Auditor General has been invited to imagine her report will be public. But at the moment, I'm relying on the T3010 that obviously is available to the public from the foundation and on media commentary. But one of the things that I found very interesting when you look at the charity information return, known commonly as the T3010, which is the filing that charities need to make to the CRA Charities Directorate every year. And in that document, it requires disclosure of all donations, receipted or not, received from foreign sources, essentially. And in the 5 years of data that are available, that the respective lines went from 0 in 2018 to 385,000 for the most recent year, which is 2022. I just note that the standards program of Imagine Canada, in which I was involved proudly, I was also part of 2 organizations that were accredited, requires that the T3010, before its file, be approved by the board of directors. And I actually think this is a really good example of the standards program pushing practice to a higher level. Often the T3010 is understood to be a kind of routine or bureaucratic, sometimes maybe even somewhat painful exercise, which directors need not spend much time. But I ask myself, if someone had looked at this carefully and had seen this line, meaning donations coming from foreign sources, ballooning to this level, whether a director who understood his or her role to ask important questions respectfully might not have asked a question of, why is it that we're receiving so much money from non-Canadian sources? And it is interesting that the Prime Minister's brother has referred to some of those contributions as coming from people who were well-intended. I loved his characterization. In fact, some of them chose to make their contribution through a Canadian subsidiary so that they could be excluded from this reporting requirement that I speak to. And this is the kind of thing, for me, that should not have been ignored by members of the board of that foundation, given the name of the foundation, the person it honors, and the incumbent in the Prime Minister's office today. Would have required a lot more diligence about the foundation being used as a vehicle, potentially by 10 people who wanted to curry favor with the Trudeau family. And again, here, I think this is an example of failing in a big way to notice patterns that should have been picked up, and it's black on white, and it's available information in public disclosures. So that is an example. It's a narrow example of something that is important, should be important. Directors should review the T3010, and they should ask probing questions before approving it. And these are the kinds of practices that are encouraged by the standards program of Imagine.
Thanks, Yves. Great points. I know we've had some really interesting conversations at Imagine Canada when our Finance and Audit Committee and then our board reviews the T3010s. As we conclude the podcast for today, I want to maybe just turn your attention to looking forward. We've talked about some of the situations that if you're a Canadian who is looking at volunteering your time, contributing your money, and trusting a family member to a program, these situations might give you cause or pause as to whether you would engage with the sector. This idea of this erosion of trust. But at the same time, we have thousands of organizations out there who are working every day in their communities and doing amazing work. In your role as a consultant, you get a chance to connect with organizations all over the place that are making a difference in their own communities. So as you think about the future of governance, what gives you hope? What inspires you from what at the sector level for those who are doing everything they can to demonstrate the highest levels of government's outstanding accountability practices and being completely transparent? What gives you hope?
Top of the list, and it's a really easy one. I said earlier, governance is in part about who has voice in decisions. So I haven't been involved in an organization either as a volunteer or as an advisor that is not committed in a really genuine way to making their boards more diverse and more reflective of Canada's diversity. It's not easy work, and people are not approaching it in a tokenistic way, and it's changing the conversations. It's really changing the quality of the conversations. And that really gives me a lot of hope. But the second piece that I would say, Bruce, is, and I go back to Enron because that's the beginning of a really vigorous conversation about the quality of governance in the corporate world. And it had as a side effect to trigger a similar conversation in our own context. And I think generally, for large numbers of organizations, people are committed to improving their practices. And the practices are changing. People are really changing. Boards are getting smaller. Boards are more engaged. Boards are dispensing with executive committees. They're meeting more often, in part fueled by the pandemic and the availability of technologies like Zoom. And they're working hard at things that are not easy, like creating a really productive, trusting partnership that reflects the interdependence of the executive director, the CEO, or the CEO and the board. And boards are choosing to be more transparent. The organizations and boards are choosing to be more transparent. So on the whole, I'm very hopeful. My fear is that these few bad apples it hurts us on this path, but the general trend is a very hopeful one.
And that's a great way to conclude our podcast today, on a note of optimism and hope. So Yves, thanks very much for taking the time to share your thoughts and observations on what are incredibly timely topics.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thanks for listening to the Let's Imagine podcast. For full show notes and to subscribe to our newsletter so you never miss an episode, please visit our website, www.imaginecanada.ca. Also, if you really like this episode, we invite you to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to this podcast, as this helps other people discover us and engage in these conversations. And again, thanks to our sponsors, Carter's Professional Corporation and Sage Canada, for supporting our podcast.